All right, ladies and gentlemen, as Uma mentioned, this is our final panel discussion. I'm really excited because we're going to talk about a very important aspect of innovation, which is leadership, innovation by leadership. And we have two CEOs from very innovative companies, Azran from AsiaX and Stuart from GE ASEAN, the CEO of GE ASEAN. Now, I'm going to start with Stuart. And as we know that a leader like Ratan Tata, Anand spoke a lot about Tata Group just now, and he was very much involved in the development of the Tata Nano, very hands-on leadership. So my question to you is, to have a successful innovation initiatives, the executive must lead the innovation process to ensure active participation, right? Now, what is your role as the CEO in the innovation process, be it ideation or development?
Great, Raj. Thank you for that question. I think to answer that, we'll start maybe at the global level of GE and describe then how my role fits into that. But I think we've worked very hard over the last some 15 years since our new chairman and CEO got that role. Prior to that, we were, as if people know GE and Jack Welch and have read his books, that we were a very productivity, cost, and driven company. We leveraged Six Sigma really to try to become the most competitive company in the world. And GE was, I think, extraordinarily good at execution. And we were growing the profitability of the company by taking costs out consistently year after year. But I think when Jeff Immelt became our CEO, we realized that in order to grow, eventually you're going to have to grow the top line. And I think Jeff realized it's not easy to change the culture from a cost-driven company to a growth-driven one. So we've really had to work hard to put instruments in place, to put a culture in place that encourages our leaders to take some big swings to drive that growth. And I can talk more about that, when we get to question and answers if people are interested in. But it's reflected in our growth values. It's reflected in our appraisal process. So it's a very holistic approach to changing the culture of the company. And we're maybe only halfway there, 15 years into it. Now it's a big company, 300,000 employees, so it takes a while. My role really is to understand our customers in this part of the world, in ASEAN, and understand what their needs are and see how we can meet them. For the most part, the products that we sell, like the aircraft engines we sell to AirAsia and AirAsia X, are global products. But there are many needs that exist out there that our global product teams don't see. So my job and everyone's job really in ASEAN is to find those needs, and if they're significant, and create an opportunity for GE for us to develop that as either new business models or new products. So I'll just give you one example. GE has a healthcare business. Historically, we've been very focused on the top of the pyramid, so selling very, very high technology diagnostic imaging equipment like CTs, MRs to hospitals, all of which are in urban areas. But as I think we all know, in this part of the world, most people live outside urban areas, and healthcare is not very good in those areas. And if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, particularly maternal and infant mortality, it's almost twice as high as global averages. So we've begun to address that. It's really, an innovative new market for us, but it takes a whole different kind of product. Obviously, you can't afford $1 million pieces of equipment. So we have, and this is just one example, but and hopefully everybody can see this out there, but it's a handheld ultrasound machine. It's battery operated. It can be connected to the internet. It can be used by midwives and general practitioners. It's very easy to use, which is important. And so midwives can scan pregnant women and determine whether the baby's in a breech position or the umbilical cord is wrapped around the neck, and then send that scan to an inner city hospital over either over the computer system or over mobile devices. And it has, we've piloted this now in several countries, and it's resulted really in reducing by half the number of maternal and infant mortality rates. So very exciting, and I think a great example of innovation for a very good use. So that's my role. We're also doing things, about 25% of all of the people in ASEAN are not connected to electricity. So we're looking at new ways to generate electricity that we call distributed power outside the grid. So we're looking at biomass, biogas. In fact, we have a pilot here in Malaysia with a company called Green and Smart to convert palm oil effluent waste to power generation. So these are the kinds of things that our teams in ASEAN are working on that would fall into kind of innovating for growth.
Thank you, Stuart. That's, by the way, an amazing product. How did this idea come about? I mean, who came up with this idea?
It's a great story. The idea actually was started in our Dr. Chen, I think, knows the story even better than I do. But it actually started in Europe, where they thought it would be a useful tool for doctors, really replacing the stethoscope. But pretty quickly, our teams in China and India recognized that it would be huge for these non-urban facilities where the need is really a lot greater. And so the product was tailored then for those markets, primarily out of the India and China research centers, and hence the product that we have today.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm sure that can be used even in certain parts of Malaysia as well. Right, speaking of product development in terms of ideas now, Azran, over to you. The innovation initiatives such as the empty seat options, the fly-through services, I believe have brought immense amount of profit for AsiaX. Now, how do you as a leader lead your team to come up with such innovative ideas? How do you coordinate this process, especially when you have different business units, and how do you integrate and how do you harmonize this as CEO?
Let me see. I think 3 O's. Optimism, obsession, and obliteration. I think as a CEO, first of all, you've got to be the ultimate cheerleader. You've got to be able to sell a vision of what's possible that others might not see. Mm-hmm. I think you've got to be obsessed about it. You've got to be maniacal from challenging every little assumption, getting every detail right. Just this morning, I was throwing a hissy fit at our premium check-in desk because the red carpet was dusty. And it's, when you get into that attention to detail, it really reinforces the psyche of everyone that small details matter. And then just when the team gets it right, you've got to obliterate it. You've got to throw it back at them and say, okay, you've got that right for now, but let's already work on version 2, version 3, version 4. And clearly everybody, my job is to drive them mad. Mm-hmm. They are never at ease, because I think, you've got to be paranoid. You've got to be constantly pushing and challenging every assumption. And so I think, that would be my role in simple terms.
Right. Interesting. And just to write on that, as a CEO, when do you know, or rather, how do you differentiate when you should look at the big picture and when to, as you said, go into the details, especially when you're talking about new ideas and so on. So how do you strike a balance?
When they start crying.
Okay, so that's when you...
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, Jack Welch says that as well. You know, you got to know when to hug and when to sort of smack. I guess. Okay, thanks, Azran. And Stuart, over to you. Speaking of Jack Welch, just now, one of the most famous CEOs. He mentioned that one of the biggest challenge in terms of change and even new ways of doing things, innovation, faced by large companies today is complacency and arrogance. These are the two words that was used, and this is something that should be avoided at all costs. So the adoption of new ideas and techniques doesn't occur naturally, but is a result of effective leadership, especially with large organizations like GE. So when promoting and adopting any innovation ideas, as a CEO, what are the main challenges that you face as a leader, and how do you tackle these issues and challenges?
You know, I would say we get constantly reminded why we can't be arrogant and complacent in this world. You know, competition is getting more intense. Our customers are getting more sophisticated. Governments are getting more involved in the regulation of what our companies do. And NGOs, social media play a role in what our ultimate success is. So I think we're overcoming that problem. I think internally in GE, to really have successful innovation, you know, there's always people who don't want to change. You know, that's probably the number one hurdle, is that inertia. So you gotta make sure that the measurement system is in place, so people know they're getting measured on becoming more innovative, driving more new products through the pipeline, thinking about new markets to go into, thinking about how we can do business more simply for our customers. And that's all really part of the culture that we're trying to create in GE.
So you're saying that innovation or being innovative is part of performance management? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes. Okay. All of our leaders are measured on not only managing the existing results of the product line and services that we have, but on incremental sales above and beyond through either new products, new markets, and in particular, we've set up an organization for GE outside the United States awkwardly called Global Growth and Operations, whose role really is only to focus on the incremental growth opportunities, whether it's new customers, new markets, new products, new service offerings.
All right, thank you. Azran, in one of your interviews, you mentioned that many previous attempts to succeed within the airline industry has failed because people came into the organization with a preconceived notion. And we know we have heard of SIA having spy flights where you have individuals traveling with competitors and reporting detailed intelligence of competitive offerings and so on. Now, what would happen if that is applied even to you in the sense where how would you address the issue of implementation and you know, ensuring that there is a barrier in imitating what you guys are already doing? So how are you overcoming that as a CEO?
You know, that's interesting, but now that you mention it, I guess those folks in Singapore did exactly that, didn't they? They've been looking at us and studying us and flying with us. And I remember when we first launched in 2007, the former CEO of SIA said, "Oh, this long-haul LCC business is not going to work. We know long-haul. People want their food. People want their in-flight entertainment." 5 years on, they've launched an exact replica of AirAsia X, just changed from red to yellow. Yep. But that's Singapore for you. It's kind of nice, right? Malaysia being ahead of Singapore. But I certainly wouldn't advocate looking at competition. I think that's very regressive and this whole idea, people get obsessed with benchmarking.
Yeah.
But to me, the problem with that is you're following others, right? And oftentimes organizations that are obsessed with benchmarking typically are literally trying to be blunt, covering their asses, right? So when they've got a new proposal, nobody wants to put their neck out to say, this is the different idea, right? Boards and management will say, well, show me who else is doing it, right? How do we compare with everyone else? And you're inevitably always just going to be in the same, you're not breaking out. So I think, firstly, it's the culture of risk-taking. And I think the problem with a lot of organizations is that we are skewed to being risk-averse, right? So we don't want to do something that's risky because if it fails, our neck's on the line, we might lose our job, or in the case of Malaysia, put in cold storage. But if somehow the idea works, then the boss gets the credit, not you. Right? So there's no real incentive to really go out and try to do something different. The simple thing for us is just creating a culture where you embrace risk-taking, you embrace mistakes, and it starts at the leadership, right? Because people aren't going to believe what you say. They're going to judge you based on the decisions that you make and the space that you allow for.
Okay, and I mean, on a practical side, it's good to have the culture to embrace failure or mistakes, but when would you draw the line? How do you manage this in terms of risk? How do you facilitate this? Where do you draw a line?
The second mistake. So you're encouraged to make lots and lots of mistakes, but make sure they're new mistakes.
Okay.
Right? If you keep making the same ones, then you're not learning from it. What's the point of that? Right?
Okay. That's a good one. That's a good one. I like that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about R&D, especially back to Stuart. Now, GE invests, we saw from the earlier presentation, that GE invests over billions of dollars on R&D. Now, Microsoft, one of the best product innovators for the last 2 decades, launched a social phone called Kin. And the product was basically a failure because many of us didn't even know that, right? And Microsoft lost about 240 million. So my question to you, Stuart, is R&D is obviously very, very important. And you have seen a number of success stories from there. But as a leader, do you think that innovation is limited to just R&D? And what lessons have you learned from innovation initiatives that your company has launched as a result of not just being R&D dependent?
Yeah, great question. First of all, not all innovation comes from R&D in GE.
Right.
Going into new markets like Myanmar, which we went into, we were the first American company to go back into Myanmar following the lifting of sanctions 2 years ago. Not R&D. Simplifying our processes and becoming an easier company to do business with in Asia is we're innovating a new way of doing business, right? Now, I think R&D is a very important source of innovation, and certainly our success depends on staying ahead of our competitors in this area. I mean, I think good examples are our aircraft engine and power generation business. Given the very high prices of oil and gas today, for an aircraft engine, if you do a life cycle cost analysis of buying and owning an aircraft engine and discount that back to when you're buying that engine, the cost of the fuel is almost exactly the same, at $100 a barrel, is almost exactly the same as the cost of the engine. So very important. And so whoever has the most efficient engine usually wins in these markets. And so if you're not ahead of the competition, you don't have a long future in the industry. So it's absolutely critical. And again, I would say back when Jack Welch was running the company, he actually was cutting R&D budgets in his last 5 years. And Jeff Immelt has been increasing our R&D budgets, including during the global financial crisis, where we took a big hit in our financial services business. So I think that really speaks volumes about how critical R&D spending is and staying the course even in tough times.
All right. Thank you. And would you say this is one of the secrets to having sustainable innovation in GE?
Yeah, absolutely. Now you got to make the R&D work, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I think Dr. Chen did a very nice job this morning about explaining how we connect the R&D that we're doing in the research labs to what the businesses see the needs are in terms of the customers and the marketplace. And so we're not taking gigantic leaps. And so, a lot of the D in particular is when we have a successful new aircraft engine, then we're taking that technology and moving it into the next engine platform, and eventually our gas turbine platform. So we get, a lot of incremental innovation generated from some of the big ideas that come out of the labs.
All right, thank you. Now, Azran, one more question for you. Many challenges in the airline industry. I think everybody knows the challenges that we are facing right now. In fact, I even had a guy come up to me just now during the break and sort of requested for me to ask a question that I'm not going to ask because he said, okay, there's one aircraft engine manufacturer and one producer and one who buys the engine. So can you please ask these two panelists, where is MH370? So I said, no, I'm not going to ask them. So you don't have to answer that, okay? Even if you know the answer now. Azran knows. Okay, right. So Azran, so many things are happening in the tourism, airline industry. Revenue from baggage fees is dropping. There are higher costs of fuel, which everyone knows, and many airlines are filing for bankruptcy. Maintenance costs going up, shortage of pilots, and so on and so forth. So many challenges in the industry. But you have innovated your business model. So my question to you is, what's the future of AirAsiaX in terms of your business model? How are you gonna face these challenges? How are you gonna continuously innovate your business model? And how are you gonna continuously to be profitable, especially since now you're a listed company?
I haven't figured that one out yet.
Okay.
Coming back to the first O, right? Optimism. And the reason why we're still in this business is because, we're perpetual optimists. We see, despite all the numerous challenges that you've mentioned, there's still a lot of upside, right? Because here in Asia, 1/10 the number of flights are being taken compared to the size of the population as compared to Europe and the US, right? We have 3 times more people, but we have 1/3 of the number of planes and flights. So that's why we see huge upside. But I think what gets me up every morning is this challenge of trying to create a completely new airline model, and specifically an airline network model. Because airlines traditionally have been very nationalistic. I mean, that's just their roots, their DNA, right? Any of the big global airline brands, typically, Cathay Pacific, right? As big as they are, based in Hong Kong, flying out, coming in. SIA, as big as they are, flying out from Singapore, everywhere, coming back in. Emirates, same thing from Dubai. Now, what we're trying to do with the AirAsia Group is say, hang on a second, that's not a very efficient network. What if you had a network that was multiple hubs in many places, right? And you could fly to each city from different points. So instead of, for example, a city like Taipei being just one end of a spoke of a Cathay Pacific network, where to that Taiwanese, Cathay Pacific, as big as they are, is a flight to Hong Kong. SIA is a flight to Singapore. Emirates is a flight to Dubai. But what we're trying to roll out is saying, when you log on to airasia.com in Taipei, we may not even be an airline's licensed to operate from Taipei. We fly into Taipei, but because you can fly into Taipei from many places, right? Eventually, flights to Tokyo on AirAsia Japan, to Bangkok on AirAsia Thailand, to KL on AirAsia X, to Kota Kinabalu on AirAsia Malaysia, to Manila on AirAsia Philippines, soon to Bali on Indonesia AirAsia X, right? And so every destination becomes almost like a hub in and of itself. Right? We're already seeing that in Singapore today, because for all those years, right, the Singaporeans say, well, we're going to block AirAsia, they're not going to get a license, they're not going to set up AirAsia Singapore. Yet, AirAsia today has over 40 flights a day into Singapore, that it's bigger than some of the airlines based in Singapore. Right? It's got flights to many cities in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, Philippines. So you become a lot more relevant as a brand to the Singaporeans than, for example, Malaysia Airlines is or Thai Airways is, because they only have flights in one direction. Right? And I think creating that model is something that's really, really exciting. Right? But it's got its challenges. You've got to learn how to operate in different countries. You've got to learn how to form joint ventures where 51% majority are controlled by local shareholders. You've got to build a Pan-Asian brand that is locally accepted in Japan as it is in Indonesia, as it is in Australia, etc. So it's much more challenging than the way airlines are being run, but to me it's very exciting because you're building a completely different airline network concept.
Yeah, thank you very much, Azran. And I totally identify with you because we operate in 10 countries as well, and it's always very different in each country in terms of the business model, in terms of dealing with the legislation and so on and so forth. So I totally identify with that. That's in the consulting business, but what more in the airline? So I'm sure there are many challenges there.